Hello, and welcome to the Current Science and Technology podcast from the Museum of Science in Boston. I'm your host, Susan Heilman, and every week we bring you interviews with guest researchers and our museum staff covering science and technology in depth. Safe drinking water is one of the world's most important resources, but it's often difficult to come by. The museum's Corinne Tate is here to talk about two new nanotechnologies to create clean drinking water. Hi, Corinne.
Hi, Susan.
How big a problem is this in the world right now?
It's a really big problem, actually. Even though the Earth is known as the water planet, there's so much water on Earth. Most of the world's fresh water is caught up in glaciers and ice caps. And a lot of it is too remote to access, or it comes kind of at the wrong place or the wrong time. Think about monsoons and floods. So as it stands right now, about 1 in 8 people on the Earth don't have reliable access to clean drinking water. That's nearly 1 billion people. And that doesn't even count instances after disasters. Think about hurricanes or earthquakes. After a large disaster, the local population often doesn't have access to clean drinking water either.
And we've got lots and lots of salt water. So if there's a better way to desalinate that salt water, that would be a huge help, or to filter any type of dirty water that there is. And so I believe those are the two different areas that we're going to talk about where there's been new technologies to try and accomplish both of those tasks.
Yes. So there are a lot of existing technologies that work pretty well to filter and desalinate water. But a lot of these are really effective in large-scale kind of water treatment facilities. But that's not always effective for populations that are in really remote areas. There's a lot of barriers to getting those large-scale installations set up, problems with funding and access to technologies.
I imagine they need electricity a lot of times for these.
Exactly, access to power. So what is generating a lot of interest is coming up with better technologies for point-of-use water treatments. And both of these new technologies are these small portable devices that could be used in very remote locations that don't use a lot of power.
Okay, well, let's talk about desalination first, a new way to get salt out of water. So this would be for ocean water?
Yes, so we're trying to take not just the salt out of seawater, but any other contaminants, such as microbes.
Right, that makes sense.
So the current methods for desalination would be distillation or reverse osmosis. And both of these actually require a tremendous amount of energy. So researchers from MIT, Sung-Jae Kim and Jong-Yoon Han, along with their colleagues from Korea, have come up with a new way to desalinate water.
And tell us a little bit about that.
This new technology would create very small portable desalination devices that could be powered by things like batteries or solar cells. And the way they work is using a phenomenon called ion concentration polarization. And what that does really is just separate the salts and the microbes from the water. You start with a stream of salt water that runs through these tiny channels over a very small nanostructured membrane, and at that membrane the channel splits into two. There's a current that runs through the membrane.
An electric current?
Yes, there's an electric current that runs through the membrane, and what that does is it actually repels any charged particles, like the salts and the microbes, and those get pushed into one of the channels, creating a very concentrated brine, if you will, but leaves the other channel with just fresh, potable, clean drinking water.
And water is neutral and not charged at all.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, this still sounds like it does need power, but it requires less power, and that's why it can run just on batteries or on solar power?
It does require power, but it actually requires only the smallest amount of electricity to actually charge that membrane. You don't need any kind of pumps, and that's usually what takes so much power, so much electricity to run these big pumps. The way this works could just be fed by gravity, so you don't need any kind of pump. You only need the small amount of electrical current to charge the membrane, and that could easily be provided by something like solar cells or car batteries.
Because a lot of times they push things through a filter, and so in order to get something through a very fine filter, enough to filter out microbes, that's where all the power comes in, is pushing it through that.
Exactly. And in this case, the microbes don't actually go through the membrane at all. Because it's charged, the membrane is actually repelling any of these particles. So it has the added benefit of these particles and these microbes don't actually run through the filter, so they don't clog it up. And that's another big problem we have with some of the other desalination technologies, like reverse osmosis, is that membrane gets clogged and filled with these particles and needs to be cleaned. That's not an issue with this one, which is another big benefit.
You mentioned that these devices are going to be portable and that it's a very small membrane that's electrically charged. How much water can you actually filter with all of this? It sounds like it's on a very tiny scale.
It is. The actual device that they've been working on in the lab is very small. We're talking about purifying drops of water at a time. But the idea is that we could incorporate, as many as 1,000 or 2,000 of these devices onto a wafer about 20 centimeters in diameter. And that many devices could actually purify as much as 18 liters of water per hour. So once it's scaled up, one of these small devices that would be about the size of a coffee urn would actually be able to purify enough water for a family.
Great. Well, that sounds not only like it's solving the size problem, but also an energy problem, a filter problem. Let's move on to the second technology that I believe also has a little something to do with using electricity and water, but does it in a different way.
Yes, this next technology actually does have some similarities with the last one I talked about. So this new technology is created by Yi Cui and Sarah Heilshorn from Stanford University. They created this high-speed filter that's just made from regular old woven cotton fibers and these special nano inks that have carbon nanotubes and silver nanowires.
You said simply, but sure, cotton's easy to find, but silver's pretty expensive, and carbon nanotubes also aren't just found at your local store. So how easy is it to make all this and put it together?
Well, the amount of silver that's in the silver nanowires is actually very, very small. So the price of that silver is almost negligible. And carbon nanotubes, you're right, they're not found on the everyday store shelf right now, but we're really having big advances in mass producing these, and the cost of the carbon nanotubes is really coming down.
So how do you put all three of these things together to make a filter?
Well, you start with the cotton fiber, the cotton fabric, and it's dunked in these solutions that include the carbon nanotubes and the silver nanowires. And because these nanomaterials are so small, they actually stick really well to the cotton fibers and they totally coat them. And these materials have really special properties. Carbon nanotubes are very electrically conductive, and nanosilver actually has some antibacterial properties. So the result is a filter that when you charge it with electricity or you run a current through it, about 20 volts, what it does is it actually kills the bacteria that pass through the filter.
So it doesn't work like the other one did where it repels those microbes, but instead it just kills them and they're still there.
Yes, so the microbes in the water actually do pass through the filter, which makes it very different from the way other filters work too. Usually a filter will exclude microbes based on size, so they have these very, very tiny pores. This one actually has quite large pores, so the microbes run right through, but there's a very strong electrical field around the silver nanowires that actually pierce the cell wall and inactivate or kill the bacteria that way. So the bacteria kind of flow right through the filter, but once they come out the other side, they're harmless because they're dead.
Does this work for other microbes like viruses or parasites?
That hasn't been tested yet. Right now they've tested it mostly on E. coli, and it was very effective in killing the E. coli. So one of the next stages is going to be to test whether or not this is really effective against other types of contaminants in the water.
What kind of power does this require? You at least need the electricity to charge up the nanowires, but do you also need it to pump the water through the filter as well?
That's a really big benefit of this filter actually, is because it has these quite large pore size. You don't need any kind of pump. It's a very high speed filter. Water flows through it very, very quickly. You don't need a pump to push it through those tiny pores of other filters. So you don't need any kind of electricity for the pump, which is a big benefit. You only need the small amount of electricity for for the filter itself. And again, that's a small enough amount that it could be easily powered by a few solar cells or small batteries, or even kind of a hand crank device or a stationary bicycle.
Does this particular filter do anything about salt, or is this mainly just for bacteria right now?
Right now, this one is just focused on eliminating bacteria from the water.
Well, both of these techniques that you described here today seem to have benefits over our current techniques, most specifically in the area of not needing as much power and electricity in order to feed these. When do they think these might be around, or they still sounds kind of like in an earlier developmental stage?
At this point, they're really in the early phases, kind of a proof of concept that these would work. These have been proven in the lab to work, but they haven't undergone the large engineering efforts that would take to really scale these up to make them ready for the field. And really, there's a lot more research that's going on in this area, because it's going to take a whole variety of different solutions that work in different situations to solve a huge problem of this magnitude.
Right, you have to worry about desalination and microbes and power and clogged filters and all different things. And so it seems like, yeah, some of these will work on their own to solve one problem, but that you might need to put a lot of them together to really come up with one big solution.
Exactly. And there are so many really unique research areas going on that are kind of trying to tackle each one of these problems.
Great. Well, thank you for telling about these two latest studies that are solving some of these problems.
Thank you very much, Susan.